I'm Kim Combs. I've been in the human service realm for approximately 40 some years. One of the things we're going to be discussing today is trauma. And Bruce Perry, who is my rock star in the traumatic research field, he said, trauma changes the biology of the brain. But one secure, loving, nurturing relationship also changes the biology of the brain. So if you don't remember anything else in the course of today, remember that you guys are making a difference in these kids' lives. You are changing the structure of their brain by loving on them, by giving them what they need, by doing the things that you do. Now, you may not ever know about that. They may not never tell you, what's going on. But by virtue of you bringing them into your home and loving on them to the best of your ability, you are indeed, research shows, changing the biology of the brain. And how do they know that? Because they have taken kids coming out of very dysfunctional backgrounds and put them in MRIs and taking pictures of their brain. These kids who have been in abusive places, when they see the pictures of the brain, it's like the dark side of the moon. There's just brown and black craters with some white going on, but not a whole lot of life in there. 6 months to a year later, when they know that their needs are going to be met, they're not just surviving, they're thriving. You can put these same kids in an MRI and take pictures, and you will see in the picture then some reds and greens and purples where the synapses are starting to connect, starting to come alive again. And 30 years ago, they didn't know that was possible. They thought if there was any damage to the brain, regardless of what it was from, it would not regenerate. So if you open up your packet, your handout, there is a survey, and it's ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. I am on the committee for trauma-informed care here in central Iowa. Orchard Place is in charge of that. I've been doing stuff with them for like the last 4 years or so. And it's just been interesting. The goal of trauma-informed care team is to let people all over the state of Iowa know how trauma affects them. And it does. It affects all of us. We're living in it. There's a term called secondhand trauma, vicarious trauma. We get that by having the kids in our home. And it's hard on us. It affects us by doing all the things that we do with these kids and the things that they dish out and how we have to respond to that. We also know that we might be working with somebody who's gone through an abusive, traumatic background. Maybe we did ourselves coming out, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. But it does affect us, even if it means nothing more than our tax dollars are going towards prevention and treatment of people who have been subjected to trauma in some way, shape, or form. So everybody in the state is affected by what happens through trauma. So our job, our role, is to help people from the principal superintendents of the schools to the janitors that empty trash to the CEOs in Iowa of big corporations to people that work under them. We want to get word out about trauma and how to deal with kids and adults who have suffered through some pretty terrible things. So the research has shown, in this first page, before I do anything else, the research has shown that all of us have had, most of us anyway, have had something traumatic happen in our life. It's hard to get to the point we are today without having something traumatic happen to us. So finding your ACE score, and you don't have to tell anybody this, you don't even have to mark it on your paper, but just keep a mental note. So, number 1, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? Or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? No? Yes. Check it. Number 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you? Or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way? Or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it. 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? 7, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes, often or very often, kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or ever repeatedly hit at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or a knife? 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? And last 10, did a household member go to prison? Now, this is just a very cursory survey that some agencies can use to get a kind of a background of you if you ever go into their agency looking for services. There are out there 23, 30 pages that you could fill out. I just took the absolute shortest ones for this sake. I did this at a school in Burlington, Iowa 2 years ago this month. And when I asked that question, there was a lady who was in her mid-50s. When she raised her hand, I called on her and she started crying. And she said, I went through every one of those. I had all 10 of those. And as she went through the questions, flashbacks came into her head because it just did that. That triggered her. It triggered her. A lot of times when we go through these things, we get triggered. So I bring this up because the research has shown that if you have 3 or 4 adverse childhood experiences under your belt, you have a higher rate of bodily maladies. You can have heart problems, high blood pressure, cancer, strokes. Your body's immune system is depleted because of the number of traumatic things that you went through that maybe you have or haven't dealt with yet. They also show with their research that kids who have, or adults who have had traumatic situations happen typically die about 2 decades before their peers who did not have that abuse in their background. Why is that? Because the research also shows that there is a higher percentage of people that are doing drugs, alcoholics, sexually promiscuous, etc., trying to kill their pain, the very things that are going to kill them off slowly over time, so they die 20 years sooner. Now remember, this is just statistically speaking. That doesn't mean if you have more than 4 adverse childhood experiences, oh my gosh, you're a mess and you're going to die 20 years earlier. No, this is statistically speaking here, and if you've got a good support system, you're working on those things, we're all work in progress, we're all under construction. Always, but statistically speaking, that's what happens. So, the next page, understanding adverse childhood experiences. What are ACEs? I'm not going to go through all these, but you can see 16 adverse childhood experiences which can include these things. So you can see, last one is natural disasters and war. I mean, we're seeing more and more of that. The kids in the community down in Florida, because of the shooting on Valentine's Day, there's going to be trauma. There is going to be trauma. My son works at Danfoss in Ames, and I didn't realize until a couple days ago, he had told me about a man who had died there due to an accident. I talked to a friend of mine, and he said, yeah, that guy died in my arms. I'm in therapy now. So just a situation, an accident that can happen at work where a person ends up dying, and you just happen to be the person standing there holding them while they took their last breath. Those are the things that are traumatic, along with these other things. So exposure to childhood ACEs can increase the risk of, and I already talked about some of them. How do ACEs affect health? Got that part right there. But on the back page, the good news is resilience can bring back health and hope. It can bring back health and hope. I told you earlier, trauma changes the biology of the brain, but it only takes one significant, loving, nurturing relationship to also change the biology of the brain, and you guys are doing that. These kids are indeed resilient, but they're going to struggle. we're going to struggle. We're going to talk about that later. The next page, it talks about the stress model. Brian Post, I was able to go to a training of his about 6 years ago. He has been known in the human service field for many, many years, but he came up with what's called the stress model. And as I went to this training, I told Brian, I'm going with some skepticism because I'm a bit cynical and skeptical about stuff just by my given nature. But when I went down there and listened to Brian talk, and he had story after story of success, and the things that he did. But one of the things that he talked about was this stress model, and I'm not going to go through the bullet points for this particularly, but just know that our perception of anger in others creates fear in us, which rapidly transforms to anger. When this occurs, we will be unable to truly see the fear experienced in another. Anger is a secondary emotion. Hurt and fear are the primary emotions, but especially as guys, we don't want to express, a more vulnerable emotion of fear and hurt. So we frequently just jump into anger. And I have been changing and growing over the course of the last 4 months really rapidly. And I'm just becoming more aware of my own wounds that I didn't know. And I've apologized to Matt and Jose both just in the last week, just saying, I was totally unaware of my own wounds as you were living in the house. And had I been aware of my wounds and able to work through them, I probably could have been a better dad. So I'm apologizing to you. And Jose said yesterday, he said, so what is it that you're apologizing for? And I said, for the fact that maybe I could have been a better dad and I could have been more in tune to the hurt in your heart rather than butting heads with you because our wounds were clashing. He said, Dad, you did the very best you knew how, and we're thankful for that. And it just felt so good to hear him say that, that, yeah, we're not perfect. We're not at all. Any one of us have our own wounds. We have our own idiosyncrasies. We're not going to always make the right choices regarding our kids and what they need. But the stress model, Brian says, is all behavior comes out of one of two emotions, love or fear. Now, when I was down there going through this, I really had a huge question mark in my head about that. Why? Because I didn't get it. But once I started listening to Brian and then brought it back to Iowa, I started looking at some of the kids' behaviors. And I remember one day that I had a conflict with Destiny. She was in middle school, and she needed to catch the bus to go 10 miles away up to Ziering for middle school at that time. And things were happening that she was going to miss the bus. Diane and I both needed to leave, and we didn't have time to drive her 10 miles up, 10 miles back, and then go to our given appointment. So I was getting really frustrated. She was getting more and more frustrated. I probably raised my voice. She definitely raised her voice, and it wasn't getting her. Power struggles, nobody wins a power struggle. Nobody ever wins a power struggle, no matter whether you think you won it or not, because nobody is any emotionally closer to anyone else in the middle of a power struggle. That's not the goal. Our goal is to pull our kids into our calm, not get sucked into their chaos. And that's hard. That is really hard some days, because as I'm learning more and more, my wounds keep me sometimes from doing that. So again, our job is to pull our kids into our calm, not to get sucked into their chaos. And I failed at that many, many times. So anyway, she was doing her stuff, and we finally got her out the door and to go to school and to catch the bus. And then I heard Diane from the living room say, "Hey honey, I forgot to tell you something about Destiny last night." And it was one of those tones of voices where my head transferred it or translated it into, oh man, I think this information is going to be important, and I probably wouldn't have responded like this had I known it. And sure enough, what she told me was that her best friend yesterday, they're kind of on the marginalized side, they didn't fit in with the popular girls, so they got left out a lot. But her best friend the day before somehow got pulled into the popular girls' circle. That left Destiny all by herself. And her best friend at the time kind of liked being a part of the popular circle. So she responded to Destiny as the popular girls did, and that killed her heart. So now she was having to go to a school bus filled with these girls who were making her life hell, and she didn't have a support system. Had I known that morning, I can guarantee you 100% I would have responded differently. She was responding out of her fear. She was terrified, and I ignored it. Not ignored, I was not aware of it. I was ignorant of it. But had I known, I would have responded differently. I know myself well enough to know that I would have. So, I would like you guys, here's a challenge, a homework assignment, if you will, to start looking at our kids' behaviors through that filter, love and fear. What's going on in them that they're fearful? Why are their behaviors like this? How many of you remember the situation at Waco back in '93, I believe it was? Do you remember anything about that, where David Koresh was the Branch Davidian cult member Messiah? The feds got word that there was some weaponry within the compound, and then just descended upon Waco, Texas. David Koresh was the kind of guy that had brainwashed tons of people, adults, and he believed as the Messiah, it was their job to bow down to him, submit to him, and do what he said. And he told all of the people that had followed him into this compound that anything outside of these four walls was going to be Babylon, and they would kill you. So he thought it would be okay, as the Messiah, self-appointed, that he could sexually abuse kids or whoever. He could physically abuse when he saw it necessary. And the adults, the caregivers of these kids, went along with it because he was, of course, the Messiah. So if you remember correctly, what happened then was they came in on sometime in March, and they had a standoff where David Koresh wasn't going to give. He wasn't going to let anybody come in there to their compound. That was his territory. But there were 21 kids they were able to negotiate out of there. And these kids, of course, had been traumatized. They were living within that. They never knew what was coming. So they brought all 21 kids, rather than separate them to, one here, two with you. They didn't want to separate because that's more trauma. So they kept them all together in kind of a retreat center type place. And Dr. Perry, a young doctor at the time, was to lead this, and he was out of Baylor University. One of the things that he talks about, and I got a chance to talk with Dr. Perry, he was at a trauma-informed care conference a few years ago, and he told the story, and I was able to talk with him one-on-one. But one of the things that he noticed about all these kids sitting in this retreat center room, they were not animated, they were listless, they were lifeless. And if you know kids, you can't bring 21 kids into a place, and not have them poke and laugh and whisper and stand up and be giddy. No, they were all zombies. Every one of these 21 kids were zombies. And one girl, I believe it was, raised her hand and looked at Dr. Perry and said, "Is today the day you're going to kill us?" Now think about that. They were told anything outside this compound was going to be Babylon, and they will kill you. So all of these kids are sitting here going, "Oops, we don't have long to live because we're outside these four walls. The Messiah told us that they would kill us." Now, if I told all of you right now that at 10:30, when we have a break, that the Iowa National Guard was going to come in, they were already surrounding the building. We had a plot and a plan, and I was going to step out, and they'd come in that door, and they start blowing all of you away. Just blowing you away. If you really truly believed what I said, that they were going to do that in 45 minutes, I would become the Charlie Brown teacher up here. Mwah, 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 mwah. Anything I said from this point on would not register in your brain in the least. You would be thinking of ways you could escape. You guys back there might think, "I'm hightailing it out now," and then we hear the rat-a-tat-tat and screaming, and then nothing. Because they're already out there, so you can't escape. You just know that you're doomed in 45 minutes. Some of you might start getting clammy hands. Some of you might feel like you're going to throw up. Your heart rate is going to increase. Your breathing might get shallow. Some of you, as graphic as this is, might get a diarrhea attack and need to hit the restroom like right now, because that's what fear does to the body. We all respond in different ways. fight, flight, or freeze. If you, at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday night when the bars close, you live on the east side here in Des Moines, and you just got paid, and you had the bank cash your paycheck, and you've got a roll of bills, and you've been out at the bar since 7 o'clock that night, so for the last 6 hours, 7 hours, you've been at the bar. And people have seen you whip out your roll of bills and pay for the drinks, maybe pay for other people's drinks. So you leave at 2 o'clock in the morning because you don't live far away and you weren't going to drive because you knew you'd be drinking. And you started hearing footsteps behind you at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're all by yourself. Your body's going to do the same thing that I just described, maybe to a smaller degree, but nonetheless it will respond. So you keep taking steps. You hear footsteps behind you. So if you're going to fight, you're going to hide behind a corner, hoping the person behind you will come that far and you can sucker punch them as they come around the corner, knock them down, disorient them enough that you can run and get out of there. Or you might skip that part. You might just go into the flight, which is running. You might jump under a dumpster, hide behind a car, climb a tree that you can get to, just so that you can get away from this person that's following you, because you have no idea what the intention is of this person, friend or foe. Or you freeze. And that's what happens to our kids a lot who have come through trauma. They freeze. They don't know what to do. And sometimes that freezing can happen when you ask them to take out the trash. And we as adults then start attributing adult characteristics to that kid. You're stubborn, you're rebellious, you're non-compliant, you're resistive, you have ODD. So we start labeling these kids, and then it starts triggering our impatience, our wounds, and then a conflict starts and a power struggle comes about subsequently. But they're not really being disobedient, they're processing. They're processing. You know, you catch them doing something, somebody's stealing a cookie. Sally, what's the rule around here? No in-between meal snacks, especially without permission. Well, that Sally then just responds in a very meltdownish situation. You didn't raise your voice, you just reminded her of your household rules, which is great to do. It needs to be done. But possibly there's something going on in her head that was dangerous where she came from. She got beaten within an inch of her life because she took something that she wasn't supposed to take. That memory's there. It's kind of like, no matter how safe our kids are, it's like the periscope on a submarine. The periscope goes up, looks around, and if there's no enemy ships that they can see, it's pretty safe to come up to the surface, open the hatch, and get some fresh air. But for our kids, the periscope is up, it looks safe, but there's a boogeyman hanging on underneath. And they refuse to step out in faith that it's safe. They are terrified all the time. And what happens in a family situation is this. You've seen mobiles over babies' cribs, 4 or 5 little stringy things that the infant toddler can play with. Well, that's kind of like a family. And so this kid pulls on this one right here. These are not stationary at that time. They are also being pulled, and they're moving as a result of pulling on this one. And that's what happens in a family situation. And I can give you an example of that, and you'll all know how to finish this. If mama ain't happy, yeah, I didn't make that up, by the way. I mean, it's just a saying I've heard forever. But that's part of that familial system. If mama ain't happy, everybody else is also walking on eggshells. There's a piece and there's a false piece. And I've experienced both. The false piece, however, is that things are going on, but as a parent, I am too exhausted. I don't feel like fighting. I am anticipating the end result, and I just don't do it. So as long as I don't make waves and confront the behavior that should be confronted, it'll stay fairly calm. But that's a false piece, because there's something underneath, and you know it's going to blow at some point, just like a pressure cooker. it's going to blow. And there are some kids who are so familiar with the chaos where they came from, they don't like calm because it's uncomfortable to them. So they have to poke and prod to get that chaos going because that's what's familiar to them. They're not doing it because, oh, I think they're too much in a good mood today. We haven't had any major crisis, in, a day and a half. Time to start one. No, it's uncomfortable for them. They want to shed, that uncomfortableness, and by doing that, they poke and prod into our vulnerable areas and our rules and make life not so fun because that's what they came from, that's what they're used to, and they want that familiarity. So just know that there's fear going on from Brian's stress model. We need to look for that. We're all going to be affected because of the mobile. Just because kids are safe doesn't mean they feel safe, and that is a really huge thing. And I'll say it again. Just because our kids are safe at your house doesn't mean they feel safe. I had a client many years ago, 16 years old, and she was taken with her sister out of a horrendous situation and adopted by a family that had everything they could possibly have. They literally were the richest people in that county. They had everything they could possibly imagine. Not that the parents spoiled them rotten, it's just that they had it available to them. There were boundaries, there were rules. They'd been there as foster kids, then got adopted, and they'd been adopted for like 7 or 8 years already. But every day that my client woke up, she believed with all her heart that today was the day that they were going to change their mind, it was a mistake, and turn her back over to DHS. 8 years with an assurance almost every day that we love you. We're not going to turn you back to DHS. We will fight the battle with you. But you can't convince them of that. And so they respond. I had a client that was 8 years old and she'd already been in 11 different placements at 8. That's a lot of placements. And a little history lesson in foster care. Back in the 50s and 60s, they used to place kids in your home for 6 months at a time and then come and move them. Why? Because they didn't want them getting attached to you. The goal was to send them back to their parents. So after 6 months, they needed to move and put somewhere else so they wouldn't attach and they'd want to go home. How many attachment disorder kids did the society produce as a result of that thinking? These kids shut off. They're never going to connect because they kept moving them. And even when I started DHS, if you had a kid for 3 years and now rights are terminated, even if you wanted to adopt that kid, you couldn't, because there were people over here on the adoption side with a list of people that wanted a 3-year-old little girl that you have, and you were foster parents, not adoptive parents, and so you would lose that child after 3 years to a home over here that was getting licensed to have a kid that was 3 years old. Fortunately, that mayhem for kids ended several years ago when they had concurrent planning with MAP, and saying, no, we can't do that. If that kid is there and you want to adopt, you get to adopt that kid, which is in the best interest of that child, by the way, and for you and your family, if that's what you want to do. So we're not doing that anymore. If you look at this chart, you will see this graph here. Now let me explain that graph to you. Dr. Perry was a runner. He had a watch thing that he put on his wrist that measured his heart rate so that he knew kind of where this heart rate was. One of the boys that he was talking with in this retreat center type place asked him what it was. He told him, can I see it? He said, sure. So he put it on this boy, probably around 10 if I remember correctly, and that heart monitor thing on that watch just zipped up. Just phew. And so he had a serendipitous moment. So he put this watch on the other kids there and saw that their heart rate was off the chart. And this was while they were just in a situation like we are right now. This wasn't a vulnerable, dangerous situation. This was their standing heart rate. And as he started asking questions, he realized that that heart rate went up because he was making them vulnerable by the questions that he was asking. The kids can lie, but their bodies won't. So you can put that thing on them, and they can say they feel fine, they feel great, they're not scared, they're not uncomfortable. But when that little thing on that watch showed that their heart rate was sky high, the words are not congruent with what the body is saying is happening. That's why when you put your kids to bed, kids who've come out of dysfunctional backgrounds, you put them to bed at 8 o'clock, you go in at 10 o'clock to check them before you go to bed, they're going, no, 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 no. Or they're no longer at the head of the bed, they're at the foot of the bed. Or they're no longer on the bed, they're under the bed. They had pajamas on, now they don't. They're processing this stuff even as they sleep. Their heart rate is up here. So imagine what happens to these kids when you wake them up in the morning. And you have to face getting on a school bus with your best friend, now colluding with the most popular girls, leaving you out. How are you going to get through your day? I used to think, back when I first became a foster parent, even with DHS experience, that my teenage boys stayed up at night thinking of ways to make my life hell the next day. It just seemed that it played itself out like that. But what I realized, and I always ask the question, why are you like you are? That question is so judgmental, and that's part of the trauma-informed team's goal, is to get us to stop asking that question and ask, what happened to you? What went on in your life? What can I do to help? Because that, why are you like you are? I mean, that just reeks of pointy finger, hand on the hip, tapping your toes like you're a bad person. And that's not the case. And then I had to start thinking about, would I be any different, seriously, if I'd gone through just what I know they have? And there's a whole bunch of other stuff we don't even know about. The social workers don't know everything. And sometimes they know very little. You get more of that information when they come into your home and start trusting you. They start telling you things a worker didn't even know, which is a good sign. But because they're starting to feel close and they're starting to feel like they trust you, that can't happen, especially if they have biological parents still in the scene that are telling them that they better not attach to the foster parents, because that just happens. Their wounds are making it such that they feel jealous of us because the kids like us and are doing better for us than they did for them. And I do remember one time being in a training where the trainer said, a while back from that particular point, a lady came through the training for foster parents, and she confessed halfway in and said, I'm not trying to be a foster parent. I'm a biological parent of a kid in foster care. And she started crying and saying, if we could have the training that you're getting, we could have our kids at home, which made total sense to me. And so I've kind of been, that's my platform, one of many, to help change the system. But anyway, there are things going on in these kids, and I just want you to be aware of the things that we don't know about. So this chart right here, that's a chart of the heart rate. 100%, that dark line is where their heart rate should be. You can see where it is by the chart that Bruce Perry came up with. You can see that over time, their heart rates start lowering, almost to the line of where it should be. Once they realized it wasn't Babylon and they weren't going to get killed, they started kind of relaxing a little bit, feeling some relief. Well then, and you probably have experienced this too, they decided that they'd do parental visits. Now remember, parents aren't always the protectors. Sometimes parents are the perpetrators. So they're terrorists in our kids' minds. So when you say, hey, your mom and dad are going to come visit, no, because then they're not safe. They don't feel safe because it was the parents that either did it to them, whatever it is, or they didn't protect them from it, whatever it is. And so either way is not a good thing in our kids' heads that parents come into the picture. So their heart rates went sky high again during that parental visit time. Then they actually started coming down to what was normal. until the fire. And I remember watching that on the news. Every station around the country was focused on the fire, the conflagration of Waco, Texas. I don't know how many people died there, but we know 21 kids didn't. But we also know those 21 kids had parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends, neighbors. And even the youngest of those kids that weren't there can figure out that in a fire and nobody survived, how terrible that would have been. Our kids are carrying around so many wounds. And I just want you guys to be aware of that, a reminder that ACEs survey we did, some of the kids in our homes might have had all 10 of those. But again, anything even over 3 or 4 still takes its toll on the body and the emotions of our kids. Okay, turning the page now. Trauma and memory. The brain is an historic organ, and it remembers everything that we go through. It's just a matter of what file cabinet we put it in. So there are 4 file cabinets here: cognitive, emotional, motor, and state. So, your name? Adam. When's your birthday, Bree?
June 13th.
June 13th. How many kids do you have in your home right now?
0.
Your address?
1285.
Okay. Those are the kind of questions that are in the cognitive file cabinet. We may not be thinking of them right now, but if somebody asks you the right question, just like that, you could pull it up. How old you are, where did you go to college, where did you graduate from high school, all of those, but you're not thinking about them until I just said it. Then your brain starts processing that information. That is the cognitive file cabinet. The next one is a little trickier, the emotional file cabinet. It's where our body remembers things that our brain doesn't know why. Several years ago, I did a training in Des Moines. And there was a person there who was going through a very bitter divorce and hated all men, of which I was one. So, all day long, she challenged my thinking. She always had to have the biggest and best stories. Literally, over breaks, the people that were in the audience would come and say, "Can you get rid of her? Can you send her home?" Because it was making training terrible for everybody, not just me. A year and a half or so later, this person comes in to the room, another training. And as soon as she walks in the door, my body feels sick. And then she said, "Good morning, Kim. How are you?" I was fine till you walked in the door. And now my whole day is shot. But that's what the body did. But I didn't remember that when she came into the room. I didn't know the previous story I told you then. It wasn't until she sat down and wrote her name on the name tent that we had in front of her that it went to the cognitive file, and I realized why my body was responding the way it was. My brain recognized her face, my brain recognized her voice, but my brain couldn't figure out why I was responding until she wrote her name. Now, she could come into the room again now, and it would be fine, because that particular training went okay. And she found another guy she obviously loved because she was now married again, and the whole day was fine. But I did not know that that was how it was going to be until a few minutes into the training. But my body responded. So the emotional file cabinet also includes things like you're making meatloaf, and all of a sudden one of the kids that was seemingly calm and cool and collected starts freaking out. You have no provocation, no indication of a provocation. She just starts freaking. One of the things that might be going on there, maybe her mom was making meatloaf when the cops came or the workers came and took her away. Her brain doesn't remember her mom making meatloaf, but the smell of meatloaf wafting through the house triggered that memory, but it's not in the cognitive file cabinet. She is responding totally on emotions. There's a story that I heard a long time ago. A young lady was adopted by an adoptive family. She was now 4 years old. They were having a picnic on the family patio. The older brother knocked the ketchup off the table onto the cement, causing it to open and shoot ketchup everywhere. This 4-year-old little girl freaked out. She didn't do it. She wasn't in trouble. It was an accident. But they didn't know why she was freaking out until they put together 2 and 2. She came to their home at 19 months or so. The cops took her out of the apartment where her mom, for who knows how long, laid on the floor dead because her boyfriend stabbed her multiple times. And her blood slowly drained out of the body onto the carpet. And when that little girl saw the ketchup on the patio, what do you think she thought of? That trauma of watching her mom be murdered and having to sit next to her after boyfriend fled until the cops or somebody could come get her. Traumatic. Smells. When I was 18 years old, I met this lady who was a Christian lady, and she and I got along so well. She was kind of my Christian mom. And this was the first person I believe that loved me unconditionally no matter what. And I loved spending time with her. I was important in her presence at 18 years old. And she helped me to open up about a lot of stuff in my life. She wore Taboo perfume. So today, even when I go into JCPenney's or Yonkers and I see the sampler table and I see a little bottle of Taboo, I will look around and I will squeeze it on my wrist. And it's not because I want to smell like a lady. That's not it at all. It's because that smells like Linda. And I can walk the rest of the day and that will take my brain back to the late 70s and my time with Linda. And she's still one of my best friends. We're both a little older now, but we still have the same kind of conversation that we had back then. And that's why that taboo is still so important. Anniversaries. Now, you might have kids that bad things happen to them in the springtime. Now, they don't know the exact date. They don't. But they knew. Their brain remembers that it was after the snow started melting, the birds started singing in the morning, the grass started turning green, lilacs bloomed. So they associate it with this time of year, even if they don't remember anything else. So they start freaking out. You might see behaviors that are going to manifest because of this time of year. We have no idea what happened in the springtime to our kids. We have no idea how that affected them. But it's going to turn up sometime in the next month or so because that's what they remember at the time. Music, that's the other one, music. I could bring a radio in here and turn to 93.3 KIOA, classic music, oldies, and at some point when those songs play, pretty much all of us is going to find a song that's going to take us back to the time that that was popular. And we're going to start having the memories associated with that song. I graduated in '76. So yesterday I was the only one home, so I turned on YouTube and just listened to classic music. And then my son came over last night before he went to work and had supper with me. And I could hear these songs in the background. And I said, oh, Matt, you know, this reminds me of, because it just took me back to that time period. And it will with all of us. Some good, some not so good. Current events, who we were dating or not dating, where we were at school, you know, all of that stuff can come back just by listening to a song back in the era of which we were growing up. So that's the emotional file cabinet. So sights, sounds, music, anniversaries are triggers. And not just for our kids either, by the way, because some of us still have those very same triggers in us. That's why they do such a good job with the home evaluation that they do in your home study. And I used to do home studies back a decade or so ago, and there were some pretty, some very vulnerable questions in there. But the reason research has shown is that they want to know, have you been sexually abused? What kind of home did you grow up in? Do you have alcoholism in your past? Not because you can't be a foster adoptive parent if those things happened, but they also want to make sure that you know that when these kids come in, those areas could be severely triggered in you. And I've worked with foster parents who were not aware of some of the things that their own abuse and their own background did until the kids came in. So we had to work through that. You know, they were good parents, but they were struggling tremendously with the behaviors because they experienced these things too. And it was just a very cognizant reminder of what happened to them. The motor skills, when we're born, if we have a normal birth and if we don't have any disabilities, we have typical milestones. You know, babies start to smile. You know, they start to bring their head up. They can lay on the floor and push themselves up. They can bring their knees up close to their stomach, and that leads them to crawling. They can then reach up and pull themselves up on a table or a couch and walk with that. Then they hold onto your fingers and they can walk by themselves. They can start running, playing frisbee, ride a bike, swim, play football, drive. You know, all of these things are all part of the cognitive or the motor file cabinet that we're able to do. Now, some of us, barring a head injury, may get to a point where we can't do those things anymore because we're too old, but we're always going to know how to do that. But head injuries, then, of course, that's different. If something happens, we get hit in the head, we take a fall, you know, whatever, then we're going to have to maybe start over. But barring a head injury, we're going to remember how to do all those things that we learned in our developmental milestones. And then the last one here is the state memory. State memory are things that go so deep. I worked with somebody one time who had, back, I don't remember what year, 80s, and she was feeling like she was falling, vertigo. And she was having visions in her head of her being in jail. And she had no idea why she felt like she was going to fall, why she was getting this picture of her being behind bars. So what happened was she had then dug up some information about her family. The feeling of vertigo was she lost control. She wasn't in control of her life right now. There were things happening that she did not have control of, and she lost that ability to feel like she had control. But the bars, she wasn't in jail. What she found out in talking with her family members was that her dad was a pedophile. And even while she was an infant toddler in her crib, her dad would stick his erection between the bars to get his jollies off of an infant child. The brain remembered that, even though she had no cognizant memory of that at all. But it went deep. She was 46 years old at that time. That stuff started coming back in her mid to late 40s. But she lived with that all of her life, her brain knowing about it, but just not bringing it to the surface where she could deal with it until 4.5 decades later. Got a friend in Boone that is an author and a speaker, and some of you might have heard her, Jolene Philo. She tells the story, and I have permission to do this, and I just saw her the other day. Her son was born without his esophagus connected to the stomach, so he had to go through a lot of surgeries, life flighted, you know, from out in the middle of nowhere, South Dakota, to Omaha to have all this stuff done. And as he grew up, there were some situations that indicated he had some struggles because of the medical trauma that he went through. And when he was 28 or so years old, you know, he had some treatment stuff done out in the East Coast, and Jolene was able to go out to this intensive treatment place, and they took him back in hypnosis, and Jolene was able to be there. They took him back to the first week he was in NICU, and they asked him to describe the head nurse and the environment, and he was able to do so to a T, and he was less than a week old. The brain remembers trauma. Imagine being a newborn infant with needles and pins and doctors and nurses, that big light that doctors used to have back in the 80s with the mask on, you know, getting poked and prodded. Living in an incubator where all you could do was put your finger in there and stroke his cheek. That was it. It was trauma, much needed to save his life. It wasn't abusive in that sense by any stretch. That's what needed to happen in order to keep him breathing and alive. But nonetheless, it took its toll. So when our kids do these things, guys, it's not because they just want to lay in bed at night thinking of ways to make our life hell the next day. They're struggling. They're trying to survive. They're trying to self-medicate so they don't feel the pain of the wounds that have been inflicted upon them. So this part of the training is to make you aware not only of their stuff, but your own. I just kind of want to open it up to questions.
I know one thing I just mentioned to my husband. We adopted he was 8 years old from foster care, severe intellectual disabilities, rare seizure disorder, many behavior issues. He had been in how many foster homes? 7 or 8 in 3 years because of his aggressive behaviors. I mean, going from one foster placement, he was there for a matter of an hour. And we've had him now for 5 years. But wanting to know, the trauma that he was going through, but because of his intellectual disability, it's so challenging.
Yeah.
And we deal with that daily. I mean, his aggressive behaviors almost daily.
How old is he?
He's 13 and a half, he'll be 14.
Okay. Yeah.
It's not like it's getting any easier because he's getting bigger and...
Yeah. But given the research, you're still providing him for the last 5 years complete stability, a place to go. You're not telling him he's going to leave. He might still be thinking at some point, I'm going to leave. And one of the things that I've noticed over the course of the years I've been in human services, and some kids have actually told me this as they became adults, if they believe they're going to get kicked out, they will do things to initiate that process. Because as they look back, they can say, well, I know why they sent me away, because I was doing this and this and this and this. But they have no way to process if you just wake up one day and say, you know what, we just want to give up fostering and you got to go. My very second placement, that's what happened. He ended up at my house because the foster parents that he'd been with for quite a while, he was 16, just said, no, we don't want you anymore. And it devastated him. Just woke up and they had to find a new home, and mine was available. So it does happen, and our kids do that sometimes. But
holidays, like with that same kid.
Oh, holidays.
Holidays, like we didn't know. We were all excited for our first Christmas. Like we adopted him a week before Christmas, and so we had made this big to-do about decorating for Christmas, and we were so excited. It was a disaster. I mean, Christmas tree was torn apart, the decorations torn apart, and he just doesn't do well with holidays.
Yeah.
I mean, we've tried for 5 years, but we've also taken away the Christmas tree. We don't put up a Christmas tree. We put up the stockings the night of Christmas Eve, so kind of play it down a little bit, and it's
that reminds me of another trauma story that maybe something like this happened at some point before you guys got him. 2 kids got taken out of their home and placed in foster care. Then this family decided to adopt these 2 kids, and they were less than 10, maybe 7 and 5 or whatever. I'll call them Sam and John. Christmas came, and they were looking forward to the adoption that was going to happen in January after Christmas, after the holidays. So Christmas came, and because they knew that the holidays were coming, they had been looking out for things they thought Sam and John would like, and then putting them in a closet. And then after Thanksgiving, when everybody puts the turkey and dressing away, they bring out the Christmas decorations, decorate the tree, wrap the presents, and have a happy holiday. Well, something was going on with Sam and John when they got the tree up and the presents, and the boys saw all these boxes and gift wrapping things with their names on them. They started freaking out, totally freaking out. Why? They were wondering, well, do they really not want to be adopted? Because the adoption's coming up in about a month and a half. Are they testing us to see if we're going to keep them, just to see how loyal we are to them? It was neither of those two, or at least to any big degree. What they didn't know was the home they got taken out of, the parents were pedophiles. And at Christmas time, they all got presents, but they had to perform a sex act on the parent with each present that they had. And so you look underneath the tree and you see all of these presents, and your worldview is, oh my gosh, I have to do a sex act on my parents with each present I got. They were freaking out, as any one of us in this room would. So again, we have no idea the abuse and the trauma that these kids have gone through. We look at them going, oh, come on, stop. We're not hurting you. Doesn't matter if you're not hurting them. It's like I said before, they are safe, but they can't tell the difference between that and feeling safe. And if they don't feel safe, they're going to respond as if they're not, no matter how safe you make your home. And when you get frustrated with that because they're acting as if they're not safe, they're acting out because they're terrified, looking at the stress model, fear and love, then it just perpetrates the cycle. You know, one of the things that I learned in a training I went to several years ago is our kids will not attach nor heal to angry caregivers. And let me say that one again. Our kids will not attach nor heal with angry caregivers, or at least to the degree that they could if we would put our own issues on hold and respond in a calm, cool, collected way, regardless of their behaviors. And I know that's hard. I have failed over and over and over again. And that's why I apologized to Matt and to Jose just in the last week, because I was aware, thinking back, oh my gosh, I could have been so different. I'm not kicking myself around for that. I just became aware, because you can't change history with us or our kids, but we can help them to see that it does not define them. It does not define us. It doesn't. And I'll just throw in this thing about forgiveness. Some of us might be carrying around unforgiveness towards somebody right now. Our kids might be carrying around unforgiveness. I try to teach the kids that unforgiveness is much like drinking battery acid ourselves, hoping the other person will die. That's what unforgiveness does. It keeps us in our own jail cell that we have the key to, that we could open up and step ourselves out. Forgiveness is not in any way, shape, or form for the perpetrator. It is for us. And I've dealt with some clients who are struggling with that because they've gone to other counselors who said, no, you cannot forgive that person. Because in their mind, and I would guess that they probably had some of their own issues, that was like giving permission it was okay for them to do what happened. No, it's not. Forgiving somebody is just letting them off the hook so that they stop living in your brain rent-free. It is all for you. Nothing for the perpetrator, because it'll take that weight off. And research is also showing now, you've all heard of post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a new one now, PTED, post-traumatic embitterment disorder. And it is wrecking lives physically. The maladies of the body that are coming as a result of the resentment and the bitterness that we have towards people is killing us. They've done research. The Center for Disease Control has done research that shows that over 90% of all medical dollars is stress related. 90% is stress related, which comes because we just hold on to things instead of letting them go. And we need to teach our kids that. But if we don't know how to do that, then we need to learn too. Because we can't draw them into our calm and not be sucked into their chaos if we don't have a pool of calm to draw from. We've got to make that for ourselves too. Any final thoughts or questions? Adam?
So along those same lines then, how do you... So my background is my family was very emotionally closed off. We weren't very open with emotions. And so how do you then model to your kids emotional vulnerability, emotional honesty, without it becoming this thing where you are getting sucked into the chaos? Like, how do you, in a sense, model, like, hey, I'm vulnerable, I'm emotionally, like, weak right now, or, you know, I'm stressed with work, or whatever the case may be, while still sort of having that calm that you draw them into?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. How do we be vulnerable, emotionally vulnerable with our kids if we are stressed ourselves and we come from a background where emotions are pretty closed off? Part of that we're going to discuss the rest of the day. But one of the things that I've gotten some flack for from parents and even some colleagues, I try to be pretty open with my kids. I mean, I don't just puke my stuff all over them, you know, and there's boundaries, obviously. But there are things that I share about my past, you know, that I think they need to know. Because we all have, you know, scars and wounds from our past. And sometimes role modeling how to share that in a positive way is healthy. Because if our kids are around adults that they think are perfect in every way, shape, and form, they're not going to let down. I can't let Cliff see me vulnerable, because Cliff comes off as a guy who's got it all together. And I don't want to disappoint him by not being like him. So I try to share. My kids have seen me cry. You know, I've gotten beyond that because like I can't do that anymore. Guys, we're not. You know, my theme song in the 70s was I Am a Rock by Paul Simon. I would listen to that song over and over and over again. Rocks feel no pain and islands never cry. You know, I walled people off because I wanted to stay safe, and I'm making decisions as I get older. No, that's not where it's at. And ladies, you guys are the emotional beings. You're relational. And guys, we are too. We're all created and hardwired for relationship. But guys, we're more fix-it people. I had to undo my fix-it mentality with my wife, who had a bad day with the kids. And I would be thinking, well, I can see why you had a bad day. Why didn't you respond like this? Do you not... Ladies, how well would that go over if you're holding part of your hair in your hand when your husband comes home from work, you know, and saying, and then this person that you're really angry with, Daddy's home, jumps up, hugs and kisses you, says, I love you, you're the best daddy ever. And your wife is shaking her head, rolling her eyes, and you're looking at your wife like, really? Sweetums here caused you a bad day? I don't get it. She's so sweet. You know, no, that's not it. Guys, when you walk in and your wife is struggling, you do not say, well, why didn't you do this? That, if you want supper and not to sleep on the couch, you better not respond like that. So, guys, and we need to get out of our fix-it mentality and just say, oh, wow, honey, it sounds like you've had a really bad day. Why don't you go take Calgon bath and I'll do the dishes and I'll finish folding the laundry. And I know that goes against some of the male profiling. You know, that's not a guy's job. Some of us grew up in homes where the guys didn't do that. But just break the mold. Just break that mold because our kids need to see it too. You know, they eventually are going to get married or at least have a girlfriend, maybe live with a girlfriend or a wife, have kids. We have to role model for them how to negotiate life. And it's not a bad thing for kids to learn how to do dishes, make their own beds, do their own laundry. Once you reach 10 years old at my house, you're doing your own laundry. I don't do their laundry after 10. Nope. Here's the washer, dryer, here's the soap, here's the directions on the back of the washer and dryer. You're responsible. Don't complain to me if you have dirty underwear and nothing clean to put on at the end of the week. You do it. You know, so we need to help our kids get to those skills because I just see a world that a lot of kids don't have that, the entitlement stuff that's going on.